At around 10:30 in the morning, Karina tried calling Faith to ask if she could give her a ride back home. When Faith didn't pick up the phone, Karina reached out to another friend who came instead. Together, they went back to the apartment, entering without concern. They assumed Faith had simply overslept after a long night out. As they stepped inside, they called out her name, expecting to hear her familiar voice in reply. The silence that lingered in the air was the first unsettling sign that something was wrong. When Karina walked farther into the apartment, it quickly became clear that something tragic had happened. The atmosphere inside was heavy, marked by an immediate sense of dread. Police officers soon arrived on the scene. What they found inside the apartment was deeply disturbing. Even experienced investigators were shaken. Faith had been the victim of a brutal attack. Despite efforts to help her, it was already too late. At just 19 years old, with her entire future ahead of her, Faith was pronounced dead at the scene. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Faith Danielle Hedgepeth was born on September 26, 1992, in the quiet countryside of Warren County, North Carolina. She carried with her not only the love of her family, but also the cultural pride of the Haliwa-Saponi Native American tribe, a community with deep roots and rich traditions. Faith's early life was shaped by the values of her heritage and the strength of a close-knit family that, despite hardships, remained bound together by love and perseverance. Her parents separated during her infancy, a change that placed her upbringing largely in the hands of her devoted mother, Connie, and her older sister, Rolanda. Even so, Faith never lost the special connection she shared with her father, Roland. He would often describe her as the very reason he found the courage to confront his most difficult battles with addiction. To him, Faith was more than a daughter. She was the light that gave him a second chance at life. Her presence, he once said, gave him hope when hope seemed out of reach. From an early age, Faith's intelligence and determination stood out. She excelled academically, consistently achieving grades that reflected not just natural ability, but also a relentless work ethic. Her efforts earned her the prestigious Gates Millennium Scholarship, an award that opened doors to opportunities she had long dreamed of. With this scholarship, she enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, one of the state's most renowned universities. At first, she chose biology as her major, imagining a career in medicine. But the transition to university life was not easy. The workload, combined with financial pressures, presented challenges that might have discouraged others. Faith, however, was not easily deterred. She shifted her academic focus, changed her major, and worked 2 jobs to help support herself. Through it all, she carried with her a dream: to become the first member of her family to graduate from college. Whether she chose the path of a pediatrician or a teacher, her goals reflected her nurturing heart and her deep commitment to helping others. Faith's life at Chapel Hill included not only academics, but also a strong sense of community. She became involved with Alpha Pi Omega, the nation's oldest Native American sorority. The group's mission resonated deeply with her, and she envisioned herself becoming a part of it one day. Faith also found companionship in her living situation. She shared an apartment at Hawthorne at The View, just minutes from campus, with her close friend and former roommate, Karina Rosie Rosario. Their friendship, like many in college, was marked by laughter, shared ambitions, and the kind of support only young adults navigating life's uncertainties can offer each other. Yet not everything in the apartment was peaceful. For a time, Karina's boyfriend Eric also lived there. His presence strained the household atmosphere as his relationship with Karina grew increasingly volatile. Their frequent conflicts, breakups, and reconciliations added tension to the once stable home. At one point, Eric attempted to enter the apartment despite no longer being welcome, even after Karina had changed the locks. With Faith's help, Karina secured a protective order, but the problem persisted when Eric moved into another unit in the same complex. Though technically apart, his proximity was unsettling, and it cast an uneasy shadow over their sense of safety. September 6, 2012, began as an ordinary day for Faith. She attended her classes as usual, and later took part in an event hosted by Alpha Pi Omega. Though she left the gathering by 7:15 p.m. to work on a history paper about her tribe, the evening was far from over. Around 8 p.m., she and Karina went to the campus library. Faith left briefly but returned around 11:30 p.m., and by midnight, the two young women were back at their apartment. Feeling the pull of college nightlife, they decided to go out to the Thrill, a popular club known for admitting students under 21. Surveillance footage later showed Faith and Karina arriving at the club around 12:40 a.m. The two friends spent time on the dance floor enjoying music and each other's company. For more than an hour, they moved with the energy and carefree joy of young students. However, by 2 a.m., Karina began to feel unwell from drinking, and the two decided to leave. Cameras recorded them exiting the club at 2:07 a.m., with Faith driving them home. Once back at their apartment, Karina reportedly grew ill and went to bed almost immediately. Around 3 a.m., a neighbor later reported hearing loud, unusual noises coming from their unit. The description was vague. Perhaps something being dropped or furniture being shifted. At the time, it was impossible to know what it meant. Digital records provided other glimpses of Faith's final hours. At approximately 3:30 a.m., her Facebook page showed signs of activity, followed minutes later by a message sent from her phone to Brandon Edwards, a former boyfriend of Karina's. The message read, "Hey B, can you come over here please? Rosario needs you more, You know, please let her know you care." Brandon did not see the message until much later the next afternoon. At 4:16 p.m., he responded, asking who had reached out, but by then, no reply would come. During that same time frame, Karina's phone also showed outgoing calls to Brandon, suggesting overlapping attempts to contact him. Meanwhile, Faith herself sent a final known message at 3:52 a.m., this time to her on-and-off boyfriend, Ty Michael McNeil. In it, she wrote tenderly, "I know you're probably sleeping, but I just wanted to let you know that I love you." At 4:25 a.m., Karina left the apartment when a friend, Jordan McCrae, picked her up. She assumed Faith was asleep and, without much thought, left the door unlocked. The following morning, around 10:30 a.m., Karina attempted to call Faith to ask for a ride back. When she didn't answer, Karina contacted another friend, Marisol Rangel, who picked her up instead. Together, they returned to the apartment shortly before 11 a.m., expecting to find Faith resting. They entered the apartment casually, believing she had simply slept in after a long night. Calling out her name, they waited for a reply. The silence that met them was the first sign that something was not as it should be. When Karina entered the apartment, it was immediately clear that something terrible had taken place. There were unmistakable signs that Faith Hedgepeth had been the victim of a violent assault. Yet strangely, there were no signs of forced entry. This detail suggested that the person responsible had either been let inside willingly or had some way of entering without raising suspicion. It was Karina, Faith's roommate and friend, who dialed 911 that morning. Her voice on the call reflected panic, disbelief, and shock. When police officers arrived, the scene inside the apartment left even veteran law enforcement officials unsettled. Faith had been attacked with overwhelming force. The crime was not just tragic. It carried with it a sense of cruelty that felt deeply personal. Despite immediate efforts, it was too late. Faith, only 19 years old and full of promise, was declared dead at the scene. In the days, weeks, and eventually months that followed, investigators began piecing together what had happened in the early hours of September 7th, 2012. Every discovery revealed disturbing details, yet each new piece of information seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. One of the first major breakthroughs came from DNA testing. Forensic specialists found genetic material that matched DNA samples left elsewhere in the apartment. This gave detectives a biological profile of the suspect, though not yet a name. A Bacardi rum bottle recovered from the bedroom quickly became one of the most significant items of evidence. On it were traces of both DNA and tissue fragments, suggesting that it may have been used in the attack. Nearby, investigators discovered a fast food bag from Time Out Chicken. Across the bag was a message written in black marker. "I'm not stupid." The strange note became one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Experts debated whether it was a genuine clue left in anger or a calculated attempt to confuse investigators. Handwriting specialist Peggy Waller examined the scrawled words and determined that the note was written in a disguised style. In other words, the person who wrote it had deliberately altered their handwriting to avoid being identified. This led investigators to believe that the killer had premeditated at least some aspects of the crime and wanted to mislead those who would eventually study the evidence. Faith's death shocked the community of Chapel Hill to its core. This was a town known for its thriving student population, vibrant campus life, and generally low levels of serious crime. Homicides were exceedingly rare, fewer than one per year. To lose a young woman who embodied such promise and positivity struck the community like a lightning bolt. Chapel Hill Police Chief Chris Blue described the case as one of the most extensive homicide investigations in the state's history. Still, despite its high profile, updates remained scarce. For Faith's grieving family, the silence was agonizing. They waited months, then years, for answers that never seemed to arrive. It wasn't until 2 years later that they learned of the handwritten note left at the scene. Likewise, they were not granted access to the autopsy report until much later. Many details remained sealed under a court order, an unusual move that frustrated not only the family, but also community members following the case. By December of 2012, the FBI had formally joined the investigation. Their involvement brought additional resources and expertise. Federal investigators developed a psychological profile of the suspect. They theorized that the individual responsible likely knew Faith and may have lived nearby. They also believed the killer might have shown strange behaviors afterward, perhaps talking excessively about the case, showing unusual interest in news reports, or otherwise drawing attention to themselves. Nearly 2 years later, in July 2014, a court order compelled Chapel Hill Police to release around 300 pages of case documents. Later, in September, the long-awaited autopsy report was finally made public. The family's painful suspicions were confirmed. Faith had been brutally attacked. The case documents revealed some surprising details about the early investigation. Only 2 apartments had been searched in the days immediately following Faith's death, her own and another unit within the same complex. Some reports suggested that the wooded area directly behind the apartment was never fully searched. Even more surprising, no scent tracking dogs were used, and officers did not conduct thorough door-to-door interviews with neighbors. For many observers, these omissions seemed like critical missed opportunities in the crucial first days. Another potential lead came from Faith's own phone. Records showed that on the night she died, she called her friend Una Chavez 3 times. One of these calls left behind a voicemail, though not in the usual sense. Investigators believed it was an accidental recording, captured while the phone was in Faith's pocket or otherwise activated without her realizing. The message was garbled and difficult to interpret, but those who listened closely thought they could detect voices and sounds in the background. Some listeners believed it revealed a heated argument. Others dismissed it as typical nightclub noise. The voicemail became a source of both intrigue and controversy. Journalists and independent researchers took an interest, and one reporter in particular became deeply invested in the case. He launched a blog and later a podcast, hoping to gather attention and crowdsource information that might bring clarity. Working with a respected forensic audio specialist named Wes, the journalist had the voicemail analyzed using advanced techniques. Wes, a veteran in audio enhancement, concluded that there were likely 4 distinct voices in the recording, 2 male and 2 female. Though the interpretation was far from definitive, the possibility that Faith's phone had captured a snapshot of her final moments added yet another layer of urgency to the investigation. The voicemail message attributed to Faith's phone was timestamped at 1:23 a.m. on September 7th, 2012. On paper, that placed the recording just before she and her roommate, Karina Rosario, were seen on surveillance footage leaving the Thrill nightclub. By 2:07 a.m., security cameras clearly captured both women walking out of the club together. To outside eyes, nothing seemed out of the ordinary in that moment. They looked like any other pair of college students heading home after a night out. Yet as investigators carefully pieced together the events of that night, inconsistencies began to appear. The timeline, which initially seemed straightforward, was suddenly clouded by unanswered questions. Forensic audio analyst Arlo West, one of the experts who reviewed the case, openly questioned the reliability of the voicemail's timestamp. If the message had really been recorded at 1:23 a.m., how could that align with video proof showing Faith still at the nightclub nearly an hour later? West explained that both Faith and her close friend, Una Chavez, owned the same model of phone, devices that were notorious for occasional issues with timekeeping and message stamping. In addition, he pointed out that the area's cell towers were unreliable, which could easily have caused delays or errors in how calls and voicemails were logged. In his professional opinion, the voicemail may not have been recorded at the official time shown on the metadata. Instead, it could have happened later, possibly closer to the critical window of time after the women returned home. Although Chapel Hill police agreed to examine West's enhanced version of the audio, they ultimately dismissed the theory. Investigators stated that they trusted the digital records and did not believe the recording captured the moment Faith was fatally attacked. For them, the voicemail remained an ambiguous piece of evidence, potentially important, but not definitive. By 2015, years had passed without an arrest. Despite the lack of closure, police reassured the public that they were confident the DNA evidence would eventually identify the killer. They declined to share exact details, such as where the DNA had been collected or what items it had been found on, but expressed optimism that advances in forensic technology would provide answers. While the investigation moved slowly, Faith's absence was deeply felt on campus. Vigils were held in her honor, including a traditional Native American ceremony to celebrate her life and spirit. Friends remembered her as someone who radiated kindness, a young woman who was both ambitious and compassionate. To many students, Faith wasn't just a friend or classmate. She was a cultural sister, someone who carried her heritage proudly while also uplifting those around her. The grief of losing her reverberated through the community, and the fear that her killer remained free cast a long shadow. In 2016, a breakthrough gave the case renewed momentum. Using DNA recovered from the scene, a lab in Virginia produced a composite sketch of a possible suspect. The technology, called forensic phenotyping, could predict physical features such as eye color, hair color, skin tone, facial shape, and even likely ancestry. The generated image suggested the suspect was of mixed background, likely Native American combined with either European or Latino heritage. While investigators emphasized that the sketch was not a perfect likeness, it provided the public with something tangible, a face to associate with the long unsolved crime. Meanwhile, detectives continued examining individuals connected to Faith. Among those scrutinized was a man spotted leaving the Thrill nightclub the same night as Faith and Karina. He had arrived at the club earlier with 3 other people, and all 4 were questioned extensively. Each provided DNA samples, but none matched the genetic evidence collected from Faith's apartment. Attention also focused heavily on Eric, Karina's ex-boyfriend. Their relationship had been volatile, and many believed Eric resented Faith for encouraging Karina to distance herself from him. Investigators uncovered troubling digital evidence. Text messages Eric sent on September 6th hinted at something ominous. In one, he asked a friend for forgiveness for something he was about to do. Around the same time, he posted a similar statement on Twitter. Then, just 3 days after Faith's death, he wrote a cryptic message on Facebook. "Dear Lord, forgive me for all of my sins and the sins I may commit today. Protect me from the girls who don't deserve me and the ones who wish me dead today." The timing of these posts alarmed investigators and intensified public suspicion. Police seized Eric's vehicle and searched his residence for potential evidence. Yet despite the troubling behavior, nothing linked him directly to the crime. His DNA did not match the sample from the crime scene, and without that connection, investigators could not tie him to the attack. While Eric cooperated with authorities, detectives never fully cleared him. To this day, he remains a person of interest, with police suggesting that even if he wasn't directly involved, he may still know more than he has revealed. Faith's family, meanwhile, struggled with lingering doubts about those closest to her. Her father, Roland, has spoken publicly about his belief that Karina, Faith's roommate, might hold information she has not shared. Others, too, have raised questions about Karina's behavior in the hours and days following the tragedy. The most notable example is the 911 call she placed. The call lasted more than 8 minutes, But during that time, Karina never once mentioned Faith by name. Nor did she acknowledge that another friend, Marisol, was also present in the apartment. To some listeners, this created the impression that she was alone. Critics of the call have pointed to the unusual wording and delivery as reasons to believe Karina might know more than she admitted. From the earliest days of the investigation, police noted that Karina Rosario's version of events left behind a series of lingering questions. Detectives recorded inconsistencies in her statements, small details that didn't always align when compared across interviews or when weighed against physical evidence. For investigators, these contradictions were not proof of wrongdoing, but they did raise the possibility that Karina knew more than she had initially shared. One particularly telling moment came from a neighbor who happened to cross paths with Karina and her friend, Marisol, only minutes after Faith was discovered. According to that neighbor, the two young women did not appear visibly shaken or distressed, a reaction that seemed unusual given the horrifying discovery they had just made. Though everyone processes shock differently, the observation added to the questions swirling around Karina's role and her reliability as a witness. The timeline of Karina's movements that night further complicated matters. She had reportedly left the Thrill nightclub early because she wasn't feeling well. Yet just a few hours later, she left the apartment again, this time with the front door left unlocked. She was picked up by a university soccer player, Jordan McRae. Later, Jordan's roommate noticed what appeared to be a small red mark on Karina's clothing from that day. When police were notified, they searched for the shirt in question and conducted forensic testing. However, the results came back inconclusive. Authorities could not determine whether the stain was blood, and the test did not link Karina to the crime. Even with no direct physical evidence tying her to Faith's murder, Karina remained a central figure in the investigation. Private investigator Hunter Glass, who worked closely with Faith's family, believed the truth might hinge on her. Glass suspected that a disagreement between Karina and Faith, possibly sparked at the nightclub and potentially involving jealousy or relationship issues, could have been the catalyst that set off the tragic chain of events. His theory, while unproven, echoed the suspicions of many who followed the case closely. Not long after the tragedy, Karina left North Carolina. She avoided the public eye and never spoke openly about the case. Faith's father, Roland, later revealed that she stopped answering his calls as well, a silence that only fueled his doubts. Nevertheless, police maintained that Karina had been cooperative each time they formally reached out. For law enforcement, she remained an important figure in the story, though never officially charged or declared a suspect. As the investigation widened, detectives turned their attention to other individuals who had been close to Faith. Karina herself revealed that Faith had been romantically involved with both her longtime high school boyfriend, Alex, and with Ty Michael McNeil, a young man she dated intermittently while at UNC. These relationships created a web of emotional complexity that investigators needed to carefully untangle. Karina described Ty as emotionally intense, someone whose passions sometimes crossed into troubling behavior. She claimed that Faith once confided in her about an argument during which Ty had pushed her against a wall. Another close friend, Una Chavis, the same person who received the mysterious voicemail from Faith's phone on the night of her death, echoed these concerns. Both women worried that Ty's temper could have played a role in the events of that night. Ty was later interviewed during a 2018 case review. He told investigators that on the evening before Faith's death, he had texted her, hoping to spend time together. He said she never responded until 3:52 a.m., when he received a sudden, affectionate message from her phone. On its face, the message seemed warm, even loving. Yet both Roland and Una believed something about it felt wrong. To them, it didn't sound like Faith. Just days earlier, she had told Una that she wanted to rekindle her relationship with Alex, which made the late-night message to Ty appear out of character. Ty provided a DNA sample, and he also claimed he had an alibi. But he admitted he was never sure whether police had fully cleared him. His name continued to hover in the background of theories and speculation, another unresolved piece of a puzzle that refused to come together. For nearly a decade, the investigation remained in limbo. Faith's murder became one of the most haunting cold cases in North Carolina, marked by suspicion, whispered theories, and an endless stream of unanswered questions. Friends, former partners, roommates, and acquaintances all came under scrutiny. Leads were pursued, evidence was tested, and timelines were reconstructed again and again. And yet, no arrests came. Then, in 2021, everything changed. On September 16, 2021, the Chapel Hill Police Department announced a stunning development: the arrest of 28-year-old Miguel Salguero Olivares of Durham, North Carolina. The breakthrough did not come from new witness testimony or a long-awaited confession. Instead, it came through DNA. In August of that year, Salguero Olivares had been arrested in neighboring Wake County on a DUI charge. As part of standard procedure, his genetic profile was entered into a database. To the astonishment of investigators, it matched DNA that had been collected from Faith's apartment nearly 9 years earlier. The long-awaited connection had finally been made. Court documents revealed that the DNA was not the only link tying him to the crime. A palm print recovered from the suspected weapon, a liquor bottle found in the bedroom, was also matched to Salguero Olivares. Combined, these two pieces of evidence created a powerful case against him. Perhaps most surprising was the fact that Salguero Olivares' name had never surfaced in the early years of the investigation. He had not been publicly identified as a suspect, nor had he been among those questioned in the immediate aftermath. His sudden emergence, nearly a decade later, stunned the community and reignited interest in a case that many feared might never be solved. For Faith's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Relief that answers might finally be within reach. Grief that it had taken nearly 10 years to come to this point, years filled with pain, suspicion, and uncertainty. For the community of Chapel Hill, the development was a reminder that even in long unsolved cases, persistence, science, and time can eventually bring the truth to light. When the investigation finally began to yield results, Chief of Police Chris Blue addressed the public with carefully chosen words. He urged patience, reminding both the community and the press that justice is a process, not an event. "This story will take time to completely unfold," he said, emphasizing that every detail had to be handled with precision. His message carried both reassurance and caution, an acknowledgement of how far the case had come and how much further it still had to go before answers could be delivered in full. Then, in November 2024, the legal battle took another decisive turn. Prosecutors filed an amendment to the original indictment, introducing 2 additional charges: first-degree burglary and a first-degree offense. These new allegations did more than increase the seriousness of the case. They painted a clearer picture of what prosecutors believed had happened that night in Faith's apartment. The burglary charge suggested that the crime was not only an act of violence, but also a premeditated intrusion. The first-degree offense underscored the severity of the accusations, leaving no doubt that the state intended to pursue the harshest penalties available under the law. For Faith's family, the amended indictment was bittersweet. On the one hand, the progress confirmed what they had long hoped for. The case was moving forward, gaining momentum, and being treated with the full weight it deserved. On the other hand, each new charge brought a fresh wave of pain, forcing them to relive the loss of their daughter and sister. The arrest of Miguel Salguero Olivares had given the case a name and a face, but it also introduced new mysteries. Who exactly was Miguel? How did he cross paths with Faith, a young woman whose circle of friends and daily life appeared far removed from his own? What circumstances led him to that apartment on that particular night in 2012? And most importantly, what truly happened in the final moments before Faith's life was taken? These were the questions echoing not only in the courtroom, but also in the hearts of the Chapel Hill community. For the public, the arrest represented both closure and new uncertainty. After nearly a decade of doubt, suspicion, and theories, there was finally a legal proceeding. Yet the case was only entering its next phase, a slow-moving journey through hearings, motions, and evidence reviews. For Faith's family, it was a long-awaited step toward justice. For the wider community, it was the beginning of another chapter, a difficult but necessary path toward uncovering the full truth. Media coverage highlighted the sheer scale of the trial preparations. By January 20th, 2025, Court filings showed that attorneys on both sides were preparing for preliminary hearings and the critical evidence phase. The case file had ballooned to over 39,000 pages of documents, a mountain of information that needed to be reviewed line by line. In addition, nearly 30 expert witnesses were being scheduled to testify. Specialists in DNA, forensic science, digital evidence, psychology, and other fields that could help reconstruct what happened. The scope of the preparation illustrated just how complex and significant the trial had become. Despite the mounting anticipation, progress in the courtroom moved slowly. Motions were filed, hearings were postponed, and schedules were rearranged. Legal experts explained that this was not unusual for a case of such magnitude. With so much evidence to sift through, and with charges as serious as first-degree murder and burglary, the system prioritized thoroughness over speed. For Faith's loved ones, however, the delays were agonizing. Each rescheduled hearing meant more waiting, more unanswered questions, and more time spent in the painful limbo between tragedy and resolution. As of July 20th, 25, official records confirmed that Miguel Salguero Olivares remained in custody at the Durham County Jail, held without the possibility of bail. Prosecutors considered additional charges, but the court ultimately decided to postpone those decisions, pushing the case forward to September 2025. The delay added yet another layer of frustration for those seeking closure, but it also signaled that the trial was approaching a pivotal stage. Faith's story, already marked by nearly a decade of silence before the arrest, had now become one of the most closely followed cases in North Carolina. For her family, every development carried the weight of both sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the years stolen from their daughter, sister, and friend. Hope that the truth, no matter how painful, would finally come to light. And so, as the legal process continued into 2025, one reality remained clear. The pursuit of justice for Faith Hedgepeth was far from over. The community, the courts, and most of all, her family were still waiting. Waiting for the day when patience, perseverance, and the relentless work of investigators would finally deliver the answers that Faith deserved. In the early hours of November 6th, 2012, the quiet routine of morning commuters along 18th Avenue in Quezon City was interrupted by a deeply unsettling sight. Lying at the side of the road was a woman. She wore a simple white top paired with blue leggings, but carried no form of identification. Local police swiftly cordoned off the area, ensuring no one disturbed the scene while waiting for forensic experts to arrive. To the trained eyes of the first responders, it was immediately clear. This was no ordinary accident. Later that day, the evening news reported the discovery of a young woman. The announcement pierced the fragile hope of one family. Louise, clutching at the faint possibility that it was all a mistake, rushed to the morgue with one of her sons by her side. Their steps were heavy, their hands trembling, as dread pressed upon them with every passing moment. The recognition was instant and devastating. The victim was Julie, her beloved daughter. Whatever fragile hope had remained was shattered in that moment, replaced by a grief that would linger forever. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. Julie Ann Rodelas entered the world on July 14, 1992, in Las Piñas, a southern suburb of Metro Manila. She grew up in a modest but affectionate household where family bonds mattered more than material wealth. Julie was one of 6 children, and life in such a large family meant that cooperation and resilience were part of her daily reality. Her mother, Laus, worked tirelessly to support them all, preparing and selling homemade meals to neighbors and customers in the community. The family operated without a father figure. His identity and whereabouts remained a mystery, and he played no part in shaping their lives. In spite of this absence, Julie was nurtured in an environment filled with love, responsibility, and the understanding that hard work was the only way forward. From an early age, Julie demonstrated an unusual level of focus for someone her age. She was disciplined, careful with her time, and keenly aware of the sacrifices her mother made to keep the family afloat. This maturity influenced her decision to pursue a degree in hotel and restaurant management at Arellano University, a private institution that she believed would one day open doors to professional stability. Her dream was not fleeting. It was a calculated step toward lifting her family into a more secure future. Yet the reality of tuition fees and the constant financial strain meant that her education was often interrupted. At several points, Julie was forced to pause her studies simply because there wasn't enough money to pay for the next semester. To bridge that financial gap, Julie turned to part-time work. Modeling, which at first appeared glamorous to outsiders, was not born of vanity or a desire for fame. It was, in truth, a practical way to cover school costs. Her entrance into the modeling industry came through a trusted connection, which gave her a chance to join commercial shoots. Those opportunities soon expanded to appearances on television and spreads in men's magazines that were popular at the time. Julie's natural grace, coupled with her professionalism, quickly helped her establish herself. She was never careless or overconfident. Rather, she approached every shoot as a job that could help her move closer to her dreams. Her growing reputation in the industry became a source of pride for her family, who saw how she balanced academics with the demands of modeling. One of the most influential figures in Julie's career was her friend, Althea Altamirano. Althea, 3 years older and originally from Cavite, had also ventured into the modeling field. By 2012, she had achieved moderate recognition, enough for her name to circulate in the local scene. Outwardly, Althea presented herself as ambitious, determined, and full of energy. But she carefully guarded aspects of her personal life. Few in the industry knew that she was the mother of 2 young children. Althea deliberately kept that information private, believing that it would make her appear less marketable to potential clients who often favored models perceived as unattached and available. Julie and Althea's friendship stretched back years. To most observers, theirs seemed like a supportive relationship between 2 women navigating the same competitive environment. Julie trusted Althea deeply, often confiding in her. But as Julie's career began to accelerate, cracks started to form in their bond. Julie's popularity grew quickly, attracting attention from agencies and publications, and with that success came the inevitable comparison between the 2 friends. In Althea's perspective, Julie had shifted from ally to competitor. To complicate matters, rumors began to surface about Althea's hidden family life. Whispers spread among fellow models that she was raising 2 children, a detail she had fought hard to keep from the spotlight. Convinced that Julie might have been the source of this revelation, Althea felt betrayed. Whether or not the suspicion was true, it fueled a sense of resentment. That moment marked a decisive turning point. Their friendship quietly transformed into rivalry. What started as unspoken jealousy evolved into tension and eventually simmered into personal conflict, though little of it was ever verbalized. The strain, however, was undeniable. Althea, worried about her standing in the industry, began sharing her frustrations with her boyfriend, Fernando. At 32 years old, Fernando ran a tattoo shop in Quezon City. While he had no connections to modeling, he carried a reputation for being temperamental and aggressive. Althea, despite sensing his volatility, stayed by his side. For her, he was both a confidant and a person who could, in her view, defend her against challenges to her reputation. Julie, meanwhile, continued her busy schedule. She often returned home late after shoots or socializing with friends. On one particular evening, she reassured her mother and younger brothers that she would be out late, reminding them not to wait up. It was an ordinary statement, one she had made many times before, yet it would mark the last conversation she shared with them that day. Later that night, as Julie and Althea walked along Diosdado Macapagal Boulevard near the intersection with Gil Puyat Avenue, an unexpected scene unfolded. At around 10:30 p.m., a dark SUV approached them suddenly, its presence abrupt and unsettling. Everything that followed took place in a matter of seconds. Julie's handbag and shoes were left scattered on the pavement. The SUV sped off almost immediately, vanishing into the city's night traffic. Althea, still standing at the scene, did not intervene and instead clutched Julie's belongings. Her visible distress soon drew the attention of nearby patrol officers. Concerned, they stopped to check on her, and upon hearing fragments of her explanation, they offered to escort her to the precinct. There, she gave a statement that was scattered and uncertain. Althea claimed that strangers in the SUV had taken Julie and that she had not recognized any of them. She insisted the incident happened too fast for her to react. She also pointed out that there had been no attempt to take her, only Julie. According to her account, the vehicle was a large black SUV, but she could provide little more detail. After her statement was recorded, the timeline revealed another detail. Around 12:40 a.m., Althea reached out to Fernando through text, asking him to pick her up. He arrived with his father, and together they drove her back to Cavite. Althea did not seek medical attention that night, nor did she return to the police station to clarify or expand her account. By the following day, she had already withdrawn from cooperating with authorities. Calls from law enforcement went unanswered, and her sudden silence raised immediate concerns for investigators. For Julie's family, however, there was no time to dwell on Althea's behavior. They were consumed with worry. Once it became clear that Julie had not returned home and was officially missing, her relatives began a frantic search across hospitals, police stations, and the neighborhoods she often visited. While the Rodellas family was desperately looking for answers, detectives took careful note of Althea's behavior. Not only had she avoided investigators, but her initial statement already contained gaps and inconsistencies that troubled authorities. Later, her own relatives would claim that her refusal to cooperate stemmed from fear, that she worried for her own safety if she revealed too much. But to investigators, her omissions seemed too deliberate to dismiss. She had failed to mention the prearranged meeting with Julie that evening, the supposed promise of a professional introduction that had brought Julie out of the house in the first place. Even more concerning, she never identified her boyfriend, Fernando, as a person of interest, despite the fact that he was directly linked to the black SUV used in the abduction. Her story gave no indication of motive, no explanation for why Julie might have been targeted. At first, the police were left with a scenario that seemed confusing, almost random. But as more evidence surfaced, the picture began to shift. According to testimony gathered later, the idea of staging an encounter with Julie originated with Fernando himself. He suggested to Althea that a scare would make Julie more cautious and would, in his words, teach her who she was dealing with. The plan was not meant to appear deadly or permanent. It was presented as intimidation, nothing more. Yet Althea, despite sensing the risks, did not reject the suggestion. Instead, she went along. She did not outline any concrete plan, nor did she step back to consider how quickly such a situation could spiral out of control. Her choices in the hours that followed were deliberate. She set the time, arranged the meeting, led Julie to the chosen location, and stood silently while events unfolded. These actions, investigators later noted, were not the result of impulse or chance. They were decisions that placed Julie directly into danger. After the abduction, Julie was transported to a residential neighborhood in Quezon City, specifically to an area known as Salam Compound, located along Leno Street. The house she was brought to was being used temporarily as a hideout. Inside were several men connected to Fernando, none of whom attempted to conceal their involvement. The gathering was not random. Each person had been assigned a role, a fact that underscored the level of planning involved. Court records revealed that the first individual to take control of Julie was a man named Efin. Witnesses would later testify that he was the one who first restrained and isolated her. Not long after, another figure entered the scene, an individual known as Aldos. Unlike the others, Aldos had not been part of the original plan. Other participants described him as unpredictable and volatile, and his presence changed the tone of the gathering completely. At the time, the house was already occupied by several men, including Jamar, Bob, and Abdeli. But once Aldos arrived, the nature of the incident shifted from a staged intimidation to something far more irreversible. Witness testimony later emphasized that Aldos had no intention of allowing Julie to walk away. Whereas the original plan, however misguided, was framed as a scare tactic, Aldos treated the situation as something final. At one point, he even stepped outside and told Julie she was going to be taken home. Believing him and grateful for the words, Julie thanked him. She did not know that his reassurance was untrue. By that point, discussions among the group had already turned toward covering their tracks and disposing of evidence. Not everyone was willing to remain involved. One participant, Jamar, grew uneasy with the direction events were taking. He quietly left the house before the night was over, a decision that would later prove critical. Jamar's testimony eventually became a cornerstone of the case, providing investigators with key details about who was present and what was discussed. For the others who remained, the plan escalated beyond return. The weapon had been brought into the house beforehand, further proof that this was not a spontaneous act, but a prepared one. As the night unfolded, tension grew inside the group. At one point, one of the men slipped and accidentally referred to Fernando by his real name, while they were still inside the vehicle. This small but significant mistake created immediate concern. Julie, though distressed, may have heard the name. If she recognized it later, Fernando feared it could connect him directly to the incident. In the early hours of November 6, 2012, residents commuting along 18th Avenue in Quezon City encountered a deeply unsettling sight. On the side of the road, they found a woman, barefoot and without a purse. She wore a white top and blue leggings, but no form of identification was found on her. Local police quickly arrived, securing the area while awaiting forensic experts. First responders observed that this was no ordinary accident scene. The absence of personal belongings, no phone, keys, or identification. In her hand, however, she still held a paper bag from McDonald's. A short distance away, detectives recovered a crumpled receipt from the same fast food restaurant, which would later serve as a small but telling piece of evidence in reconstructing her final hours. When the evening news announced that the authorities had discovered the body of a young woman earlier that morning, the atmosphere in one family's home collapsed into shock and disbelief. Her mother, Laus, accompanied by one of her sons, hurried to the morgue with heavy hearts and trembling hands. They dreaded the possibility that the unidentified woman might indeed be their beloved Julie. Upon arrival, they were met with the stark reality of loss. The clothing described by investigators matched exactly what Julie had been wearing when she left the house that night. A final, painful confirmation came when her mother was asked to identify the victim face to face. The grief-stricken recognition shattered whatever hope remained. Julie was indeed her daughter. For the family, this revelation was devastating beyond measure. Julie had never vanished before, not even for a single day. She was known for keeping in close touch, even if she happened to stay with friends or relatives overnight. Silence was unlike her, and that silence had now ended in the most tragic way possible. Her loved ones, trying desperately to understand what had happened, had attempted to reach out to her friend Althea, but their calls went unanswered. This lack of communication deepened suspicion and concern. Soon, police began forming a clearer picture. There were threads linking the victim, her friend Althea, and a man known as Fernando. The first investigative breakthrough came from an unexpected clue. A McDonald's receipt found clutched in the victim's hand. Detectives immediately recognized its potential significance. They examined the timestamp and traced it to a McDonald's branch on United Nations Avenue. Through a formal request, they obtained surveillance footage from the restaurant. The footage provided crucial visual evidence. A man of medium height, covered in tattoos, could be seen placing a late-night order around 2 a.m. His face was clearly visible, and investigators now had a lead that could directly tie an individual to the events surrounding Julie's last moments. Simultaneously, police pursued another promising lead. Witness statements about a vehicle spotted leaving the scene in haste. Several individuals reported seeing a black SUV, believed to be a Mitsubishi Montero. Two witnesses even recalled fragments of the license plate. Working with this information, authorities traced the vehicle's registration back to a woman named Rosalina Quiambao. Background checks soon revealed that her son, Fernando Quiambao Jr., more commonly known by his nickname Jaro, was the regular driver of the SUV. With that discovery, investigators could now place Fernando firmly at the center of their growing case. On November 9th, police initiated formal surveillance of the Quiambao family residence. Although Fernando himself was not immediately observed, the following evening yielded significant movement. Around 6 p.m., officers noted that Fernando's father, Fernando Quiambao Sr., Zrenia, left the residence driving a black Toyota Innova. Observers documented that he carried a bag with what appeared to be a change of clothes. Maintaining discretion, law enforcement tailed the vehicle northwest. Approximately an hour later, the Innova stopped in Apalit, a rural village in Pampanga province. There, Fernando Sr. entered a traditional Filipino hut, a bahay kubo, tucked quietly in a secluded area. Parked close by was the black Mitsubishi Montero registered to Rosalina, Fernando's mother. The presence of both vehicles at the location signaled to investigators that they were close. Acting swiftly, police entered the property. Inside, they found Fernando Quiambao along with Althea. Neither resisted arrest, and no weapons were discovered. However, the alignment of evidence, the witness reports, the SUV, the fast food receipt, and the suspect's known connection to the victim was sufficient for authorities to detain them. A forensic team was immediately dispatched to the scene, ensuring that every detail was documented for evidence. The suspects were transported to the station for questioning. The investigation continued into the late hours. Around midnight on November 11th, law enforcement units raided another property being used as a temporary holding site for additional suspects. The situation escalated quickly. Armed individuals were present inside. Shots were fired during the operation, resulting in the fatal wounding of one suspect, Fahad Osman, who was known by the alias Bob. Other individuals, including Jamar Waraji and Jalan Pasawan, were subdued and taken into custody. Both were formally charged with illegal possession of firearms, adding another dimension to the case. At the outset of questioning, every suspect denied involvement. They insisted they had no knowledge of Julie's disappearance or what had happened afterward. But as interrogations continued and the weight of evidence pressed harder, cracks began to show in their stories. Jamar, under mounting pressure, was the first to shift. He admitted that he had been inside the house where Julie had been held. Gradually, his willingness to cooperate grew. He explained that his involvement had been fueled by loyalty to Fernando, who frequently provided him and others with money and alcohol. Jamar went further, naming additional figures involved in the unfolding tragedy. He identified one man as Effin Talib and another by the alias Aldos. According to Jamar's account, Aldos had been unpredictable and acted outside the group's original intentions. He claimed that Aldos escalated the situation far beyond what anyone had anticipated, changing the course of events in a way that spiraled beyond control. Meanwhile, Althea was questioned separately. Her testimony painted herself in a more sympathetic light. She admitted she had been persuaded to lure Julie to the location, but insisted she had not realized what the true plan entailed. According to her, she thought the goal was merely to frighten Julie, not to cause her serious harm. She expressed regret and attempted to distance herself from the decisions of others. Fernando Quiambao, in stark contrast, refused to cooperate. Throughout his questioning, he remained silent and defiant. He demanded that his arrest be considered unlawful, arguing that no direct evidence linked him personally to the crime. His insistence on silence created a sharp divide between his stance and the partial cooperation of the others. With multiple suspects in custody, contrasting testimonies, and tangible physical evidence, investigators now found themselves piecing together a complex puzzle of relationships, loyalties, and betrayals. The investigation eventually confirmed what authorities had long suspected. 8 individuals had been directly involved in the crime. Their names surfaced through evidence, testimony, and careful detective work. Fernando, Althea, Jamar, Jalan, Efren, Aldos, Bob, and Abdeli. Of these, one, Bob, would later lose his life in a police encounter. It soon became apparent that this was not a crime born out of sudden rage, a personal dispute, or a heated emotional outburst. Rather, it was something far darker and more calculated. The acts were part of a coordinated and premeditated plan, carried out step by step, which ultimately ended in the irreplaceable loss of a young woman's life. As more details were revealed, the case began to draw widespread attention. Local newspapers carried daily updates, radio programs debated motives, and television segments highlighted the progress of the police. The public followed developments closely, horrified by the sheer scale of involvement and the apparent planning behind it. Within law enforcement circles, the case moved into high gear, with multiple units, criminal investigation, forensic teams, and intelligence officers, working together in an effort to secure airtight evidence. Following her arrest, Althea Alamirano became one of the first to face extensive questioning. Though she agreed to speak, her demeanor was defensive from the very beginning. She attempted to distance herself from the others, portraying herself as someone who had been manipulated, pressured, and ultimately controlled by her boyfriend, Fernando Quiambao. In her narrative, she was not a willing participant but a victim of circumstance. She told investigators that, after the abduction, she had gone into shock and became paralyzed with fear. This, she claimed, was the reason she misled police at first and failed to reveal the truth about where Julie had been taken. Her testimony painted her as someone cornered into silence, insisting she never knew the full extent of what was unfolding. But not everyone's story aligned with hers. Jamar Waji, another of the arrested suspects, gave a strikingly different version of events. His statement directly contradicted Althea's claims. Where she minimized her role, he outlined details with clarity, describing how the plan had been formed, who had taken charge of each element, and how the operation was carried out step by step. His account suggested that Althea had been more aware than she admitted, raising serious questions about her credibility and casting doubt on her insistence that she was simply misled. As more suspects were taken into custody, law enforcement encountered yet another complication. Two of the accused, Aldos and Ifine, managed to disappear before they could be apprehended. Their sudden absence disrupted the otherwise steady progress of the case. Police officially declared them fugitives, and nationwide bulletins were circulated with their descriptions. Composite sketches, drawn with the help of Jamar's cooperation, were shared with the public. Yet despite those efforts and the spotlight of national media coverage, the two men successfully evaded justice, not only in 2012, but for years afterward. Their names remained on wanted lists, their whereabouts a mystery that haunted investigators. The case took an unexpected turn with one of the detainees, Jilan Pasawan. In January 2013, after months in custody, he was granted release on bail. His freedom was short-lived. On June 15th of that same year, an incident occurred. During what should have been a quiet family meal, an unidentified assailant entered the property and fired shots at Jilan. The attack was swift, leaving no opportunity for defense, and Jilan lost his life instantly. His wife, however, made a controversial decision. She declined to cooperate with police and signed a waiver blocking any formal investigation. With that waiver in place, the case surrounding Jilan's death was officially closed, leaving the identity of the assailant unknown and the motive unexamined. For investigators, the loss of Jilan was more than just the death of another suspect. It meant the disappearance of a potential witness, someone who, whether guilty or innocent, might have shed light on the complex planning behind the abduction. Although Jilan had denied direct involvement, his exact role remained ambiguous, and now, with his death, those unanswered questions would never be resolved. By the summer of 2013, the case had reached a turning point. Most of the individuals identified as part of the crime were either behind bars or listed as fugitives. Althea continued to insist she bore no real responsibility for what happened. She rejected any direct connection to Aldos or Ifine, even as evidence and testimony pointed otherwise. Witness accounts, documented timelines, and verified facts consistently undermined her claims. For investigators, the picture was clear. While levels of involvement varied, the chain of responsibility was undeniable. And yet, despite all these efforts, justice moved slowly. Nearly 12 long years passed between the day of Julie Ann Rodelis' tragic death and the first sentencing in the case. The investigation, though thorough, faced delays, appeals, and procedural obstacles that stalled the path to trial. Families of both the victim and the accused endured years of uncertainty, waiting for the justice system to conclude what had begun so many years earlier. It was not until 2024 that a formal trial was finally scheduled for the two central figures, Fernando Quiambao Jr., better known by his nickname Jaro, and his girlfriend, Althea Alamirano. The initial court date was set for July 12th, but procedural complications forced rescheduling not once but 3 separate times. Finally, in September, the trial began in earnest. Court sessions unfolded over several months. The hearings were painstaking, involving careful examination of witness statements, case files, forensic documentation, surveillance recordings, and even recovered text messages exchanged between the involved parties. Each piece of evidence was presented before the court, weighed against the suspect's claims and defenses. Notably, however, the firearm believed to have been used in the fatal incident was never recovered, leaving a key gap in the physical evidence. Still, the testimonies and corroborated details formed a strong case. Even as the trial progressed, 2 of the original suspects, Efin Talib and Aldos, remained beyond the reach of authorities. Their absence was a constant reminder that the case, though moving toward resolution, was not yet fully closed. At the conclusion of a lengthy and carefully followed trial, the presiding court finally reached its judgment on the 2 central figures in the case. For Fernando Quiambao Jr., known widely by the name Jaro, the outcome was severe. The court declared him guilty of kidnapping and participation in acts of coordinated aggression. While the evidence presented did not directly establish that he had been the individual who pulled the trigger, the prosecution successfully argued that his role was far from passive. The decisive moment, according to the court, came when Fernando issued the order to handle Julie after realizing she had recognized him. That single directive was interpreted as a clear signal of intent, an order that set into motion a chain of events from which the victim would never return. The justices explained their reasoning in formal language. Even in the absence of physical evidence linking Fernando Quiambao to the firearm itself, the authority he exercised and the instructions he gave carried decisive weight. His leadership role, combined with his presence at key stages of the operation, transformed him from a background participant into someone legally accountable for the irreversible outcome. For the court, it was not necessary to prove who had pressed the trigger. What mattered was that Fernando's decision made the fatal act inevitable. Because of this conclusion, Fernando Quiambao was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the legal stipulation that he serve no less than 22 to 40 years before any possibility of release. In addition to the prison term, the court imposed financial restitution, 500,000 Philippine pesos, equivalent to approximately $8,400, payable to the victim's family. This sum, though symbolic compared to the magnitude of their loss, represented the justice system's acknowledgement of the harm inflicted and the need to provide some form of material reparation. For the second accused, Althea Alamirano, the judgment was notably different. While prosecutors pushed for harsher charges, the court carefully reviewed the available evidence and concluded that her actions fell under a narrower legal classification. She was convicted of participation in a kidnapping, but cleared of the more severe allegations of intentional involvement in violence or direct knowledge of the plan's fatal trajectory. The court highlighted key weaknesses in the prosecution's case. There was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that Althea had known beforehand about any intent to escalate the abduction into something more severe. Likewise, prosecutors could not provide irrefutable proof that she had been present at the crime scene after the abduction took place, nor that she had personally communicated with fugitives Aldos or Efin during the critical hours. Because of these gaps, the panel of judges concluded that the charge of conspiracy to commit kidnapping was the only one that could be upheld beyond reasonable doubt. By the time this verdict was delivered, Althea had already spent over 12 years in detention while awaiting trial and judgment. The court determined that the time she had already served exceeded the penalty required for her conviction. As such, her sentence was declared fully served, and her immediate release was ordered. Along with her release, she was required to pay a fine of 100,000 pesos, a sum that represented her share of accountability in the larger scheme. Yet even as the court issued this ruling, it made note of unresolved contradictions. Several pieces of evidence, including testimony from other suspects and digital records, indicated that Althea had played a more active role in the early stages of the plan. Witnesses described how she had first floated the idea of teaching a lesson, and evidence suggested she was the one who arranged the initial meeting point. She had also passed information to Fernando and ultimately led Julie to the location where the abduction occurred. These facts painted a picture of someone more involved than her conviction technically reflected. For the victim's family, the outcome was bittersweet. On the one hand, Fernando's life sentence delivered a sense of long-awaited justice, affirming the depth of his responsibility. On the other hand, the release of Althea, who they believed had played a pivotal role in setting the tragedy in motion, left them with lingering questions. Heather's hands shook so violently that she could barely grip her phone. Her fingers fumbled across the screen as she somehow managed to dial 911. Her voice, raw with panic, cracked as she tried to force out the words. My friend, she's hurt," she gasped, almost choking on the terror in her throat. The dispatcher's tone remained steady, calm, yet urgent. "What do you mean hurt? Can you tell me how she's hurt?" Heather's thoughts scattered. Words tumbled from her lips in broken fragments, a torrent of fear that made little sense. The dispatcher pressed on, voice unwavering. "Listen to me. Is Britney conscious? Can she respond?" Heather's reply was devastating. She admitted she didn't know. She hadn't checked. She confessed, her voice cracking, that she had run, blinded by terror, her only thought survival. By the time detectives and first responders converged on the trailer, a dreadful silence had settled over the scene. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, searching, confirming what they had feared all along. At the entrance, on the ground, was Britney. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Britney Steyer was born on June 10, 1989, in the quiet town of Stuart, Florida, a place that blended the laid-back charm of small city living with the coastal beauty of the Sunshine State. She spent most of her childhood just a short drive away in Port St. Lucie, where her parents, Betsy and Joe, raised her alongside her older sister, Christy. Her mother, Betsy, was a woman of faith and vision. Over the years, she transitioned from simply being active in local church life to eventually founding her own congregation, a community that became a cornerstone for many families in the area. Her father, Joe, pursued a very different path, carving out a career with a development company where his steady work ethic provided stability for the household. Although Britney's parents divorced when she was around 5 years old, they worked hard to shield their daughters from the bitterness such separations often bring. Rather than creating a divide, they remained deeply committed to co-parenting. Both Betsy and Joe prioritized the girls' emotional well-being, making sure Britney and Christy spent meaningful time with each of them. This arrangement, though unusual in its smoothness, gave Britney a sense of security. She grew up knowing that even if her parents were no longer together, their love for her was unwavering. From an early age, Britney stood out. Her personality was magnetic, bright, cheerful, and full of warmth. Teachers described her as someone who lit up a room the moment she entered, and friends were drawn to her boundless energy. She was the type of child who not only participated in activities but inspired others to join in. During her teenage years, Britney found joy in volunteering at a church camp in Silver Springs. Summers spent there became some of the most formative experiences of her life. She quickly gained a reputation for being the girl who could turn any ordinary day into an event. Whether she was organizing dance competitions, stepping into comedic skits, or encouraging her peers to take part in talent shows, Britney's natural confidence shone through. She wasn't afraid of the spotlight, but more importantly, she used her charisma to uplift others, making even the shyest campers feel included. As she entered adulthood, Britney transitioned from her spirited volunteer work into the realities of the workforce. In her early 20s, she secured a job as a cashier at a local Winn-Dixie grocery store. What began as a humble entry-level role quickly became a stepping stone to leadership. Her strong work ethic, paired with her outgoing charm, didn't go unnoticed by management. Within a relatively short period, Britney rose from cashier to front-end manager and eventually to grocery manager, a position where she oversaw both the grocery and produce departments. Her coworkers respected her not just for her organizational skills, but for her kindness. She had a way of treating everyone, from customers to fellow employees, with dignity and warmth. It was during this chapter of her life that Britney's path crossed with Edward June McNeil Harris Jr., a 28-year-old who worked at the local Burger King. June's background was complicated. He was already the father of 5 children from 2 previous relationships. For many, that alone might have been a reason to pause. But Britney was not one to shy away from challenges. Her nurturing and compassionate nature made her more willing than most to embrace complexities. To her, June's children weren't a burden, but an opportunity. She welcomed them into her life with open arms, treating them as if they were her own. Still, those who knew Britney best were cautious. Heather, one of Britney's closest friends, recalled her first encounter with June as unsettling. The meeting was fleeting. Just a quick hello while Britney grabbed food at Burger King. But Heather felt a deep unease. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, yet something about him felt wrong. Her concern grew when she mentioned June to her husband, a local police officer. His reaction was immediate and intense. Though he refrained from sharing specifics, he issued a stern warning. Britney needed to stay far away from June. Alarmed, Heather tried to pass on the message, but Britney wasn't receptive. Deeply invested in her new relationship, Britney dismissed the warnings. She defended June passionately, insisting that no one else could understand the bond they shared. Despite the red flags, Britney continued to see June as someone who brought joy and excitement into her life. She described him as a partner who understood her adventurous and big-hearted nature. She wanted to believe in him, to focus on the good rather than the concerns voiced by others. Her optimism, the same trait that had always made her shine, now led her to overlook troubling signs. By early 2016, their relationship had moved at a rapid pace. Just months into dating, Britney discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with overwhelming joy. For Britney, motherhood wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. She saw it as the beginning of a beautiful new chapter, one that would bring purpose and deepen her connection to June. She began to plan for the future, envisioning the kind of mother she wanted to be, full of love and patience. But life, so full of promise, took a tragic turn. Britney went into premature labor at just 5 months. The crisis unfolded with alarming speed, thrusting her into a situation filled with fear and uncertainty. For a first-time mother, the hospital room became a place of emotional chaos, hope and despair colliding moment by moment. Desperate for comfort, Britney turned to her family. Her sister, Christy, rushed to her side, determined to be there in her most vulnerable hour. Together, they faced the whirlwind of medical procedures, decisions, and overwhelming emotion. Yet the person Britney needed most, June, was nowhere to be found. Christy tried everything to track him down. She called his phone repeatedly, drove to his trailer, and even pounded on his doors and windows. Hours slipped away in a haze of panic, but June never appeared. His absence, so glaring in such a critical moment, spoke volumes. Tragically, Britney's baby, whom she had lovingly named Jade, did not survive. The loss devastated her. She had already pictured her child's future, imagined birthdays, school days, and countless milestones. Losing Jade was not just the loss of a baby. It was the collapse of dreams she had built in her heart. June's failure to stand by her during this unimaginable heartbreak was a painful revelation. It was a red flag so large it could no longer be ignored, exposing a side of him that clashed harshly with the picture Britney had so desperately tried to believe in. For friends and family, it confirmed their fears. Yet, in a familiar cycle that would sadly repeat itself throughout her relationship, Britney chose once again to forgive June. Her heart, guided by a hope that was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous vulnerability, clung to the belief that things could change. She convinced herself that love had the power to heal the cracks in his character, that patience and loyalty might bring out the best in him. And so, instead of walking away, she pressed forward, determined to carry on with the relationship. Seeking a new beginning, Britney made the decision in March 2016 to relocate to Bradenton, Florida to live with her father. The move represented more than just a change of scenery. It symbolized a chance to step away from the emotional wounds of the past and begin crafting a brighter future. In Bradenton, she found an immediate sense of support and familiarity in her father's presence. With his guidance, she soon secured a position at the same sign company where he was employed. As always, Britney's personality made her stand out. Her smile, her ability to connect with others, and her tireless work ethic quickly earned the admiration of both co-workers and clients. People liked being around her. She had a way of brightening the workplace. Those early days in Bradenton offered her something she desperately needed: stability, routine, and the faint glimmer of a fresh start. But the past was not so easily left behind. Distance, rather than breaking the tie between Britney and June, only seemed to strengthen it in her eyes. Almost every weekend, Britney committed herself to a grueling 6-hour drive back to see him, pouring her money, her energy, and her heart into maintaining the bond. It was Britney who shouldered the cost of travel, the emotional labor, and the effort to keep them connected. June, on the other hand, gave little in return. This imbalance, the one giving endlessly and the other taking freely, became the quiet pattern of their relationship, one that would define the years ahead. By 2017, Britney had grown weary of the strain that long distance imposed. Despite the warnings of family and friends, she persuaded June to move to Bradenton. Always the one to take initiative, she found them an apartment and even helped him secure a job with her brother-in-law's appliance installation company. For a brief moment, it appeared that stability might finally take root. But almost immediately, the cracks began to show. June possessed the skill to handle the job, yet his temper repeatedly sabotaged him. Co-workers grew cautious around him, employers issued warnings, and conflict became a recurring shadow in his professional life. Britney, ever loyal, tried to smooth things over. But with each flare of anger, she absorbed more of the burden, just as she always had. As the months passed, the changes in Britney became noticeable to those around her. The once vibrant woman, known for her warmth and openness, grew quieter. Co-workers who had admired her enthusiasm now observed a more withdrawn version of her. Even in the sweltering Florida summers, she began covering herself with long sleeves and pants. When questioned, she brushed it off with quick excuses. An accidental bump here, a clumsy fall there. The answers came easily, almost rehearsed, as though she had prepared for the questions she knew were inevitable. Her family, too, sensed the shift. Betsy, her mother, and her stepfather noticed immediately that something was wrong. They had met June early on and had seen firsthand the controlling nature lurking beneath his surface charm. Now, from the outside looking in, they saw Britney working multiple jobs to keep the household afloat while June contributed little but demanded much. She gave everything: her time, her paycheck, her energy, her very spirit. And in return, she received little more than criticism and control. Later, her mother reflected on Britney's choices with heartbreaking clarity. Britney had been raised to love unconditionally, to always look for the good in others, and to believe in the power of kindness. To her, even brokenness could be mended with enough love and patience. She believed with all her heart that if she simply loved June enough, she could fix him. She could heal him. That hope kept her tethered to him, even as the warning signs multiplied. In February 2018, Britney's life took a dramatic turn once more. She discovered she was pregnant. The news stirred mixed emotions. Joy surged through her at the thought of becoming a mother again. But beneath it was a quiet, unspoken fear. She worried about what the future might hold, especially given the growing instability in her relationship. Those fears were tragically validated when she arrived at a family gathering with a visible bruise darkening her face, poorly concealed beneath makeup. Concerned relatives asked what had happened, but Britney quickly dismissed it, claiming she had slipped in the shower. She delivered the explanation with a tight smile, but those who knew her best could see the pain behind her eyes. It was another excuse, one of many, crafted to shield both herself and the man she still insisted on defending. On March 2nd, 2018, Britney gave birth to a baby boy. For a fleeting time, happiness returned. Holding her newborn, she felt a surge of purpose and love unlike anything else. For that moment, she believed her family was complete, that motherhood might be the anchor that steadied the storm of her life. But only 3 months later, Britney learned she was pregnant again. The news arrived as a surprise, but true to her nature, she met it with optimism. Instead of dwelling on the challenges, she threw herself into preparations, determined to create a home filled with love and stability for her growing children. In February 2019, Britney gave birth to a daughter. With 2 young children in her arms and a new, larger apartment to raise them in, the outside world saw a young mother building the life she had always dreamed of. To casual acquaintances, it might have seemed that Britney was living her happily ever after. But behind closed doors, the reality was starkly different. Emotional manipulation grew stronger. The demands, the criticisms, the silent punishments, all escalated. The walls of their apartment became a stage for conflict, leaving Britney carrying the weight of despair while trying to shield her children from it. Her heartbreak deepened when she began to notice troubling changes in her son. The little boy, once playful and carefree, now lashed out in sudden bursts of aggression. Yet almost as quickly as he acted out, he would seek comfort, clinging to his mother with desperate affection. His behavior mirrored what he had witnessed, moments of tension followed by a longing for love. It was a painful reflection of the environment Britney had worked so hard to hide. This realization shook her to her very core. For Britney, the truth was no longer avoidable. Remaining in this situation wasn't only endangering her, it was shaping her children in ways that could leave lasting scars. Her love for them, a love that knew no limits, forced her to confront the reality she had long denied. Staying was no longer an option. She would have to make a change, no matter how difficult, to protect the 2 lives that meant more to her than her own. On the morning of January 31st, 2020, Britney finally reached the moment she had been building toward in silence. It was the day she decided that enough was enough. That morning, June, who had the day off, casually announced that he would be heading out with friends sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock. To him, it was nothing unusual. But to Britney, his absence created the first real opening she had been waiting for. She didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't even let her face betray her plans. Instead, she quietly went about her routine as if nothing were different. Yet inside, her heart was pounding. She began gathering her belongings, carefully, quickly, and without fanfare. She didn't pack suitcases that might draw suspicion if discovered. Instead, she stuffed her and her children's things into plastic bags, the kind anyone might overlook. Each bag loaded into her car represented not just clothing or toys, but a piece of her freedom being reclaimed. By the time she was ready to leave, she was no longer just running errands. She was running for her future. Once in the car, Britney's first call was to her sister, Christy. She suggested a spontaneous trip to Orlando, telling her it would be fun to take the children to Disney World. On the surface, it seemed like nothing more than a cheerful getaway, a chance to create happy memories and give the kids a day of laughter and magic. But beneath that cheerful cover story, this trip was much more. It was Britney's first real attempt at breaking away, her symbolic step toward a life where she and her children could breathe freely again. The weekend at Disney brought smiles, photographs, and the fleeting illusion of normalcy. Britney cherished every laugh, every moment watching her children's eyes light up with wonder. Yet even as she soaked in the joy, she knew reality was waiting just beyond the gates of the theme park. When the weekend ended, she faced the truth with newfound clarity. She could not go back. Determined, Britney reached out to her parents and asked if she could move back in with them. It was a vulnerable request, but also a bold declaration that she was ready to fight for independence. Her parents, seeing her desperation and courage, welcomed her without hesitation. Still, Britney knew that this step carried danger. For many survivors of controlling relationships, the act of leaving marks the most perilous time. And Britney's case, tragically, would prove that reality. June reacted exactly as those close to Britney feared he would. Almost immediately, he flooded her phone with calls and text messages, his words swinging wildly between pleading apologies, grand promises, and chilling threats. He cycled through manipulation tactics in rapid succession, begging for another chance one moment, vowing dark consequences the next. He was relentless, and Britney, though shaken, tried to stand firm. On February 11, 2020, Britney walked into the Sarasota Police Department with resolve. Her voice trembled, but her courage was undeniable as she filed a report against June. She recounted in painful detail a terrifying incident that had taken place only days earlier. After she had left him, Britney agreed to meet June briefly to collect the last of her belongings from their shared apartment. She had imagined it would be a short, civil interaction, just an exchange of items, nothing more. But instead, it turned into hours of fear and intimidation. Behind the closed door of that apartment, June refused to let her leave. He held her there, his words laced with threats, painting chilling scenarios of what could happen if she didn't bend to his will. For Britney, those hours felt like an eternity, each moment heavy with terror. By the time she finally walked free, she carried not only her belongings but also the knowledge that she was in greater danger than she had ever allowed herself to admit. Her bravery in filing the report led to immediate action. June was arrested, ironically, at the very doors of the Sarasota Police Department. When questioned, he shut down, refusing to answer and demanding an attorney. Still, the charges he faced were serious: aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and illegal possession of a firearm, a particularly weighty offense for a convicted felon. For a brief time, it seemed as though Britney might finally have the protection she needed. For Britney, this arrest should have been the first step toward freedom, a turning point toward safety. But, as so often happens in cases of abuse, compassion clouded her judgment. Persuaded by promises from June's family, who swore he would seek therapy and that they would personally oversee his treatment, Britney made the heart-wrenching decision to drop the charges. Her father later recalled how torn she had been, confessing that she couldn't bear the idea of her children growing up with their father imprisoned for life. Her choice was born out of hope and compassion. But tragically, that hope would not be rewarded. In the months that followed, Britney threw herself into rebuilding her life. She focused on her children with renewed determination, working long hours and slowly reconnecting with friends she had grown distant from during her years with June. On social media, her posts painted the picture of a woman rediscovering herself, smiling at family gatherings, laughing with friends, stepping out into the world with a spark that had long been dimmed. To those around her, it was clear: Britney was healing. But June was never far from Britney's world. Despite the long history of hurt, broken promises, and late-night arguments that still haunted her, Britney allowed him only limited contact with their children. In her heart, she feared what that decision might one day cost her, but at the same time she believed, perhaps against her better judgment, that her kids deserved at least some form of relationship with their father. She told herself that a child should know where they come from, even if the connection was fragile, complicated, and tinged with risk. June, however, had not truly changed. His behavior followed the same exhausting pattern Britney had come to know too well. Apologies whispered with practiced sincerity, sweeping promises of change that dissolved within days, and subtle but powerful emotional manipulation meant to keep Britney orbiting around him. Every word, every gesture seemed designed to pull her back into the same cycle she had fought so hard to escape. Then came July 18th, 2020, a date that, on the surface, should have been nothing but joyful, a milestone in friendship rather than a night of sorrow. Britney traveled to Crawfordville to attend her best friend's engagement party, where she was proudly standing as maid of honor. For once, she felt free to set aside the constant worries that shadowed her daily life. She slipped into her dress, fixed her hair, and stepped into the gathering with a renewed energy. Surrounded by people who loved her, Britney danced beneath the warm glow of string lights, laughed until her voice rang clear, and allowed herself to forget, even for a few hours, the heavy burden of fear she usually carried. Those who watched her that evening would later say it was as though the Britney they remembered, the vibrant, smiling young woman full of hope, had returned, if only for a fleeting moment. Her smile was bright, her laughter unguarded, and her presence filled the room with light. But joy has a way of being fragile. And that night, it proved heartbreakingly brief. As the evening wore on and music softened into the background hum of conversation, Britney's phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from June. The tone was sharp, impatient, and unyielding. He demanded that she return immediately. The transformation in Britney was instant and unmistakable. Just moments before, her face had been glowing with happiness, her spirit buoyed by the love of her friends. But as she read the words on the screen, her expression hardened. Her shoulders tensed, her eyes grew distant, and her laughter fell silent. Her friends, who had just seen her reclaim a sliver of peace, now watched helplessly as a familiar shadow crept back across her face. The weight of fear and worry settled over her once again, heavy and suffocating, like a storm cloud blocking out the light. Britney, her nerves tightening and her instincts whispering that the night could slip into something dangerous, did not want to face June alone. She reached out to the person she trusted most, her longtime confidant, Heather. With a quiet urgency, she asked her to come along. Heather hesitated, sensing the unease in Britney's voice. But loyalty and friendship won out. She agreed to accompany her, unaware that the decision would draw her into a night neither woman would ever forget. Neither could have imagined that the hours ahead would mark a turning point, a moment where everything would change for Britney, her family, and everyone who loved her. The drive toward June's trailer was heavy with silence. Britney's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. Her usual habit of filling the air with lighthearted chatter was gone, replaced by the weight of unspoken dread. Heather would later recall how Britney's natural brightness seemed to dim with every passing mile. It was as though each turn of the tires carried them deeper into uncertainty, into the center of a storm waiting to break. Britney's shoulders were stiff, her jaw tight, her eyes locked forward on the dark road. Even the quiet sound of the tires on gravel felt unnervingly loud against the silence inside the car. They arrived around 10:30 p.m. The property lay shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the van's headlights cutting across the dirt driveway. What might have been an ordinary Florida evening felt unsettlingly still, the air thick with unease. As the headlights swept across the yard, the women caught sight of a group gathered near an above-ground pool. Music had faded, but the remnants of a party lingered. Beer cans, empty bottles, and a makeshift table cluttered with discarded drinks. The laughter and chaos of earlier hours had melted into the late-night quiet. Britney parked and stepped out, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Heather remained in the passenger seat, watching intently, her stomach tight with dread. Britney approached the trailer door, every movement purposeful, as though she knew this exchange could shift in an instant. When the door finally opened, June stood there. At first, their exchange appeared calm. Words were spoken in low tones. From where Heather sat, it looked almost like a routine conversation. Tense, perhaps, but controlled. Then, everything changed. Without warning, June produced a firearm. The quiet of the night shattered in an instant, replaced by chaos. The sound cracked through the still air, sudden and terrifying. Heather's instincts took over. In one swift motion, she vaulted into the driver's seat of the van. The side door remained open, swinging slightly as panic overtook every rational thought. Throwing the van into reverse, Heather sped away down the dirt road, her only focus on getting as far from the trailer as possible. Gravel flew beneath the tires as she fled into the night. Moments later, she forced herself to stop the van. Her hands shook violently as she fumbled with her phone and dialed 911. Her voice, raw with fear, trembled as she tried to convey the unimaginable. My friend's been hurt," she gasped. The dispatcher pressed for details. "What do you mean hurt? How is she hurt?" Heather's words tumbled out in fragments. She tried to explain through the panic. that they had gone to the trailer, that an argument had seemed to ignite out of nowhere, that everything happened so fast. She said a shot rang out, and she had driven away as quickly as she could. The dispatcher's voice remained calm but insistent. "Is Britney conscious?" Heather's response was heartbreaking. She didn't know. She admitted she had fled in terror, that she had been focused only on escaping. Her voice cracked as she added that she was trying to get to Britney's sister, hoping that Christy would know what to do. As Heather tried to steady herself, law enforcement units were already mobilizing. Reports came in that June had fled in his green vehicle. Officers spotted the car speeding recklessly, weaving aimlessly through parking lots, doubling back along quiet roads as though he couldn't decide where to go. The pursuit was tense, but ultimately short-lived. June eventually pulled over near Spring Creek Highway. When officers approached, he made no attempt to resist. The man who had caused so much terror simply surrendered, as though the fight had drained from him the moment he was confronted with accountability. Meanwhile, detectives and first responders converged on the trailer. What they discovered confirmed the worst fears. There, near the entrance, lay Britney. Nearby, a discarded bottle sat half buried in the dirt, an everyday object turned haunting symbol, representing the family gathering that would never again be complete. Two young children, innocent and unaware, were now left without their mother. News of Britney's death tore through the community like a shockwave. For those who had known her, it was impossible to reconcile the young woman remembered for her laughter, generosity, and vibrant spirit with the grim reality that her life had been taken. Family members were devastated, her friends shattered, and neighbors stunned into grief. In the weeks that followed, more chilling details emerged. Investigators uncovered a series of text messages June had sent to Britney earlier that evening. The messages started demanding, then escalated into outright anger when Britney didn't respond the way he wanted. Each message revealed mounting frustration, a dangerous progression that foreshadowed the tragic events of the night. June Harris was charged with first-degree murder, child neglect, fleeing and eluding law enforcement, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. His criminal history, paired with the overwhelming evidence from that night, painted a clear and damning picture. His trial began on December 16, 2022. The defense attempted to cast doubt, to suggest alternative explanations, but the prosecution presented a powerful case. Text messages, witness testimony, forensic evidence, and even surveillance footage left little room for uncertainty. The narrative was consistent, and the conclusion inescapable. On December 21, 2022, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge handed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, alongside 3 additional consecutive 15-year sentences for the other charges. For Britney's family, the verdict was both devastating and consoling. Justice had been served, but no legal sentence could ever replace the woman they lost. Britney's children would grow up without their mother. Her parents would carry the weight of her absence forever, and her friends would always feel the hollow space left by her laughter. Britney's story now stands as a sobering reminder of the unseen struggles many victims endure behind closed doors, and the terrible cost when cries for help are not fully heard. Her life, filled with love, generosity, and resilience, continues to echo as both a cautionary tale and a call to action: to listen, to notice, and to protect those who may not yet be ready to walk away. In the early hours of January 16th, while heavy snow continued to blanket the winding roads, a utility worker made his way down Jacobs Creek Road. Through the curtain of white, something caught his attention: a silver SUV, oddly positioned near the edge of an embankment. The engine was still running. Curious and uneasy, he pulled over, stepping out into the cold. Crunching through the snow, he approached the vehicle cautiously. Inside, in the driver's seat, sat a woman, motionless. Within minutes, emergency services arrived. The scene was eerily still. The cold air pressed in, and the only sound was the low hum of the idling engine. One single set of footprints trailed away from the SUV, vanishing into the dark woods. There were no skid marks or tire tracks that might suggest a crash. The vehicle bore no damage, and there was no evidence of forced entry. It didn't take long to identify the woman. She was Michelle Nice, a mother of 3, a consultant for Macy's, and the wife of a once prominent scientist. Her death was sudden, mysterious, and profoundly tragic. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Michelle Nice was born in November 1969, the 6th of 7 children, in a modest fishing village nestled on the fringe of Manila Bay in the Philippines. Her earliest memories were painted with the scent of salt water, the sound of boats clinking against wooden docks, and the voices of vendors calling out in the early morning. The family home, like many in the village, was a simple wooden structure built on stilts above the tidal edge. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no modern amenities, only the bare essentials, shared smiles, and unwavering resilience. Despite the economic challenges surrounding her, Michelle's childhood was filled with warmth. Her parents worked tirelessly to provide for their large family, and though there was rarely enough money, there was never a shortage of love. Her father, in particular, was her anchor. A quiet man with strong hands and kind eyes, he taught her the importance of humility, perseverance, and hope. Their bond ran deep. He encouraged her to dream, even when those dreams felt impossibly distant. Michelle was not the loudest among her siblings. Reserved and introspective, she often watched more than she spoke. But her presence lingered, felt more than heard. There was something striking about her, something unspoken in the way she carried herself. It was a kind of grace, a quiet strength that drew others to her. From a young age, she held aspirations that reached far beyond the bamboo walls of her home. She yearned for more than what the village could offer, more than the life she saw playing out around her. She craved opportunity, adventure, and above all, love. For as long as she could remember, Michelle Rivera had been fascinated by the idea of the United States. She had heard stories, seen photos, and listened intently to tales shared by those who had family abroad. America, to her, represented possibility. At just 16, Michelle achieved something extraordinary. She was accepted into a prestigious school for administration and business. For someone from her background, this was a rare and remarkable achievement. It was the kind of opportunity that could alter the course of her entire life. But dreams are often weighed down by reality. After only 1 semester, the financial burden became too heavy to carry. Her family simply couldn't afford the tuition or the costs associated with living away from home. Though devastated, Michelle refused to let go of her ambitions. Her parents, with tears in their eyes, promised they would do everything in their power to save enough for her return. Still, Michelle had no intention of standing still while waiting. Determined to take control of her future, she packed what little she owned and moved in with an aunt in a nearby town. There, she began working as a waitress in a modest restaurant. It was a busy place, popular with both locals and visitors. Coincidentally, the town sat near a US military base, and Michelle found herself serving American patrons on a daily basis. English became a regular part of her environment, but speaking it fluently was still a hurdle. She couldn't afford language lessons or tutors, yet she knew that mastering English was essential if she ever hoped to build a life in the United States. In a moment of bold creativity, Michelle came up with a unique solution. She placed a small advertisement in the Manila Times, seeking a pen pal from America who could help her practice English. The ad was brief and modest, accompanied by a simple photograph. She had no idea that the ad she wrote in the quiet corner of a noisy restaurant would change her life forever. Thousands of miles away in Pennsylvania, a man named Jonathan Nice came across that ad. Jonathan, born on May 26, 1950, was the eldest of 4 brothers raised in the modest town of Collegeville. His upbringing was defined by discipline, humility, and hard work. His parents were not wealthy, and raising 4 boys demanded sacrifice and frugality. Still, the family found strength in unity and perseverance. Jonathan's academic path led him to Temple University in Philadelphia, where he worked tirelessly to support himself. His passion for science and medicine carried him through graduate and postdoctoral work. He eventually found himself at the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, and later at the Kenneth Norris Cancer Center, 2 prestigious institutions where he gained a reputation as a driven, dedicated researcher. Jonathan was known not only for his intellect, but for his quiet intensity. He was methodical, thoughtful, and deeply committed to his work. During those formative years, Jonathan met a woman named Sylvie. Their relationship spanned 7 years and ended in what friends described as a peaceful, respectful divorce. Though the marriage ended without bitterness, it left Jonathan with a lingering void. As he entered middle age, a new desire emerged: to build a family, to share his life with someone deeply and sincerely. In the early 1990s, that yearning led to an unexpected encounter. While having lunch in a cafeteria, Jonathan met a young woman from the Philippines. Her warmth and elegance caught his attention immediately, though he soon learned she was already in a relationship. Still, she handed him a newspaper, the Manila Times, and pointed out a pen pal ad placed by a friend of hers. That friend was Michelle. The ad intrigued him. There was something about her photo, her expression, her eyes, that lingered in his mind. She looked thoughtful, hopeful, and real. On a whim, he wrote her a letter. In that first correspondence, Jonathan included an older photo of himself. Wanting to bridge the age gap, or perhaps nervous about it, he shaved nearly 10 years off his actual age, telling Michelle he was in his early 30s when, in reality, he was closer to 40. Jonathan had sent Michelle a photograph of himself early in their correspondence, but the image, taken years earlier, painted a version of him that no longer reflected reality. In the photo, he looked young, vibrant, and full of promise. A man seemingly on the verge of settling down and building a life rooted in stability and success. He had carefully chosen that picture, knowing first impressions mattered. Alongside it, he crafted letters filled with warmth and sincerity, sharing hopes, dreams, and assurances that he was ready to create a life with someone who could share in his vision. Michelle, who was then in her late teens or early 20s, responded with equal earnestness. For her, each letter that arrived was a small miracle, pages that carried words from a world she had only imagined. The letters took weeks, sometimes months, to travel across oceans, but the distance seemed to shrink with every envelope that arrived. Jonathan spoke of things Michelle had only dared to dream about: a home in America, children running through sunlit rooms, a marriage built not just on love, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. His letters were vivid, filled with imagery of peaceful suburban neighborhoods, supportive communities, and a future far removed from the hardships of her upbringing. He painted a picture of a life where family came first and where her dreams, too, could flourish. For Michelle, whose sense of duty toward her family was deeply ingrained, the idea of marrying a stable and successful man from the United States must have seemed like both a personal blessing and an opportunity to give back to those she loved. It wasn't just about escaping poverty. It was about stepping into a world where she could contribute, support, and maybe even thrive. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of her heart, it felt like destiny. Yet, through all the promises and affection, one thing remained unspoken. Neither Jonathan nor Michelle told their families about the growing relationship. Their romance existed in a private space, nurtured by ink and paper, held together by hope, and untouched by the judgment of others. It was a secret world they had created together, one that offered escape, connection, and possibility. After many months of exchanging letters, Jonathan made a decision that would alter both of their lives forever. He resolved to travel to the Philippines and marry the woman he had fallen for, despite never having met her in person. His certainty was unwavering. He believed that what they had was real, that their connection, built on honesty and emotional vulnerability, could survive the leap from paper to reality. When they met for the first time in June of 1990, Michelle was filled with anticipation. But as Jonathan stepped off the plane, she was struck by an unexpected wave of surprise. The man standing before her was clearly older than the image he had sent. Time had altered the lines on his face, added a heaviness to his frame, and revealed a gap between the image he had shared and the person who now stood before her. The difference was clear, even jarring, and yet, after a moment of pause, Michelle said yes. Despite the initial shock, there was something about Jonathan that still drew her in. He was articulate, respectful, and clearly cared for her deeply. Her father, a man who had always placed family above all else, gave his blessing after meeting Jonathan. Promises were made. Jonathan vowed to support Michelle's family financially, and Michelle, perhaps still processing her own reservations, chose to believe in the dream they had built together from afar. The wedding took place just days later, on June 11th, 1990. Even then, Jonathan continued to obscure the truth. On the official marriage certificate, he listed his birth year as 1958, making himself appear 8 years younger than he actually was. The deception was subtle but intentional. No one from Jonathan's family attended the ceremony. In fact, none of them even knew he had flown across the world to marry a woman he had never met before. He kept the entire event a secret, worried that people back home might misunderstand or judge his decision. The idea of others suggesting he had engaged in some kind of transactional relationship haunted him. Together, Jonathan and Michelle rehearsed a cover story. When she arrived in the United States, they would tell everyone they had met in Hawaii, where he had allegedly been attending a medical conference. It was a story they both committed to, knowing it would make things easier when questions inevitably came. The visa process was long and complex. Nearly a year passed before Michelle could join Jonathan in the US. During that time, their letters remained steady, each one reinforcing the bond they had forged. Finally, on April 19, 1991, Michelle boarded a plane for the very first time in her life and made the long journey across the Pacific. They settled into a modest home in North Carolina, where Jonathan worked as a research professor at East Carolina University. In the beginning, life together felt like an adventure. They traveled to California, exploring sun-soaked coastlines and bustling cities, treating the trip like an extended honeymoon. Jonathan introduced Michelle to friends and colleagues as his wife, and most accepted the Hawaii story without much scrutiny. Those who were skeptical chose not to press. Jonathan seemed happier than anyone had ever seen him. In January 1992, Michelle gave birth to their first child, a son they named Alex. Less than 2 years later, in November 1993, their second son Trevor was born. Jonathan was overjoyed. He embraced fatherhood with devotion and pride. His office at the university was decorated with family photos, snapshots of vacations, birthdays, and quiet moments at home. He often said that Michelle and the children had given him something he never thought he'd have: a home filled with laughter and life, a reason to live beyond his research. But beneath the calm surface of their seemingly idyllic life, undercurrents of tension began to swirl. Jonathan's insecurities grew stronger with time. Michelle, with her warmth, charisma, and beauty, drew attention wherever she went. She made friends easily, connected with neighbors, and adapted quickly to her new life. And as her confidence grew, so did Jonathan's quiet anxiety. He became increasingly possessive. Small doubts turned into long silences, then into subtle restrictions. Though he never voiced it directly, Jonathan worried that Michelle might one day realize she had choices, and that she might choose a different path, one that didn't include him. Professionally, however, Jonathan's star was rising. In 1995, he took a bold leap by founding his own biotech company, Epigenesis Pharmaceuticals. The company focused on pioneering treatments for respiratory illnesses, particularly asthma, a condition that affected millions but still lacked curative solutions. Jonathan's research was ambitious. He wasn't just trying to manage symptoms. He wanted to change the way medicine approached disease at the genetic level. Years of study culminated in a breakthrough. His research was published in Nature, one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. In the article, he introduced EPI-2010, a revolutionary gene therapy delivered through an inhaler. The treatment targeted asthma at its molecular source, suppressing the expression of the genes responsible for the condition. It was the kind of innovation that could reshape the medical field. Investors took notice quickly. Funding poured in. Jonathan was invited to speak at international conferences and appeared in media interviews. He presented himself as not only a dedicated scientist, but a man who cared deeply about improving lives. In March 1998, their third child was born, a daughter named Samantha. With 3 children, a growing company, and public recognition, Jonathan appeared to be at the pinnacle of personal and professional fulfillment. One of the biggest turning points in Jonathan's career came when a prominent investor placed $5 million into his biotechnology firm. The momentum was immediate. With growing credibility in the scientific community and renewed interest from venture capital, Epigenesis Pharmaceuticals began to scale rapidly. Annual operating budgets soon surged to $11 million, and the once modest startup transformed into a rising player in the pharmaceutical landscape. With growth came responsibility and more travel. Jonathan's schedule became increasingly demanding. He spent at least 1 week of every month away from home, flying to conferences, holding private meetings with investors, and pitching the company's vision to potential partners. At times, it seemed like he was living out of a suitcase, always on the move, always chasing the next breakthrough or checkbook. His presence at home became increasingly sporadic. By the year 2000, the company's success demanded even more. A larger, more strategically located headquarters was necessary to accommodate expanding operations and better connect with East Coast investors and talent. Jonathan made the decision to relocate the company's base to New Jersey. And naturally, the family followed. They settled in Hopewell Township, a serene and affluent suburb known for its expansive properties and quiet charm. Their new home was nothing short of grand, a sprawling estate with manicured lawns, soaring ceilings, and every modern amenity. On paper, it was the American dream fully realized, a luxury home in a respected neighborhood, 3 healthy children, and a career that had, at one point, seemed unstoppable. But behind the gleaming windows and freshly painted walls, life for Michelle was becoming increasingly difficult. She had left behind more than just an address in North Carolina. She had left behind her circle of friends, a community that had welcomed her, and the familiar rhythm of a place where she felt rooted. In New Jersey, she knew no one. Jonathan's absences were now more frequent, his mind consumed with corporate pressures, boardroom politics, and the science that once brought him so much joy. Michelle, left to navigate a new town with 3 young children and no emotional support system, found herself lonely and disconnected. Seeking structure and self-care, she began going to a local gym. At first, it was just a way to stay active and break the monotony of her days. But over time, it became a place where she could briefly reconnect with other adults, a place to feel seen. Jonathan, increasingly uneasy about her independence, responded with a controlling gesture masked as generosity. He had a private gym built inside their home. On the surface, it was a gift. In reality, it was a strategy, an effort to limit her time in public, to pull her back into the world he could control. Michelle later described the shift as being placed in a golden cage, a beautiful prison that sparkled on the outside but left her feeling increasingly confined. By 2001, Michelle was searching for purpose beyond family duties. That search led her to a new personal project, a complete redesign of the family garden. It was more than landscaping. It was her attempt to shape something of her own, to express herself in a space untouched by Jonathan's rules. Jonathan, hoping to please her, approved the plan despite its steep $50,000 price tag. She hired a landscaping crew, and among them was a man who stood out, Miguel de Jesus. He was professional, quiet, and warm, with a presence that contrasted the cold distance growing between Michelle and her husband. At first, the connection was harmless. Friendly conversations, shared laughter, a spark, perhaps, but nothing more. Then came the unraveling. By 2002, Jonathan's professional life was taking a turn for the worse. The asthma treatment he had once championed as a revolutionary advance in gene therapy, EPI 2010, was not delivering the promised results in clinical trials. Although the compound had shown strong results in lab settings and animal models, it fell short in human trials, particularly among patients who were already using standard asthma medications. The excitement around the drug began to fade. Investors, once eager and confident, grew restless. Then came the dot-com crash, and with it, a widespread collapse in confidence across technology and biotech sectors. Money dried up. The board of directors began asking hard questions. Ultimately, they made a bold decision. Jonathan was to be replaced. He was formally ousted from the very company he had founded. In March 2003, his dismissal was finalized. The dream he had nurtured for years was stripped from his hands. With no steady income and the weight of a substantial mortgage pressing down on them, the family's finances became increasingly unstable. But Jonathan, unwilling to reveal weakness, pretended that nothing had changed. To neighbors and acquaintances, he spoke confidently about new projects and exciting ventures. He claimed to be working from home on special research initiatives and even told some he was writing a children's book. Behind closed doors, however, Jonathan's demeanor shifted. He began drinking more heavily. His mood, once ambitious and optimistic, became brooding and distant. On his darker days, he could turn cold, emotionally detached, sometimes sharply irritable. The confident scientist had become a man adrift, clinging to appearances. While Jonathan spiraled quietly, Michelle was navigating her own path. Her connection with Miguel deepened, moving beyond casual chats to something more intimate. They were both married. Both had children. But somehow, in the spaces between their conversations, something else had taken root. Something emotional, and eventually, something physical. At first, Jonathan noticed nothing. His world was consumed by professional loss, reputational damage, and the mental strain of maintaining a carefully constructed facade. But gradually, small things drew his attention. Late-night phone calls, unusual charges on the phone bill, a quiet shift in Michelle's behavior. Then came a moment that would shake the fragile structure of their marriage even further. At a birthday party for one of Jonathan's brothers, a casual family gathering meant to be lighthearted, a seemingly innocent comment changed everything. Jonathan's mother let slip that he was, in fact, the eldest sibling. Michelle froze. For years, Jonathan had told her that the brother being celebrated was the oldest. It was a strange lie, subtle but deliberate. And in that moment, years of confusion suddenly aligned. Michelle was stunned. The man she had married had lied about his age from the very beginning, altering the truth to appear younger. 8 years of deception. 8 years of half-truths and omissions that she had unknowingly accepted. The realization shattered what little trust remained. Though Jonathan tried to explain and apologize, something had shifted irreversibly in Michelle's heart. It wasn't just about the lie. It was about everything that had been built on that lie. She felt betrayed, disillusioned, and emotionally isolated. It was during this emotional void that she turned once more to Miguel. This time, she gave him her number. She wanted to meet, for coffee, for conversation, for connection. What had once been cautious turned bold. Their meetings became more frequent, and their relationship evolved into a full-fledged affair. They met in private, booked hotel rooms under aliases, exchanged gifts, and shared intimate moments away from the scrutiny of their everyday lives. Michelle, craving affection and attention, even bought Miguel expensive items, gifts she kept hidden from Jonathan. But secrets rarely remain buried. In late 2003, Miguel's wife, Patricia, discovered the affair. And when she confirmed the truth, her response was swift and direct. Patricia confronted Michelle face to face, demanding answers. Jonathan's growing suspicions began to harden into certainty. For months, something had been gnawing at him. Unspoken tension, lingering glances, quiet absences that couldn't be explained away. He had already sensed that Michelle was drifting from him, emotionally and physically. Their arguments at home had become sharper, more frequent, and less easily resolved. The warmth that once marked their conversations had turned into cold silences or bitter remarks. Jonathan, ever analytical, started digging. He combed through their phone bills, cross-referencing call logs and timestamps. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. Michelle had been speaking to Miguel frequently. Too frequently. The frequency, timing, and pattern of the calls left little room for misinterpretation. He didn't want to believe it, but the facts were undeniable. Yet, despite knowing the truth, Jonathan couldn't bring himself to confront Michelle directly. He feared what would come next. He feared hearing her say the words he dreaded most, that she no longer loved him, that she was leaving. Even after the lies, the betrayal, and the distance between them, Jonathan wasn't ready to let her go. He still wanted to believe their marriage could survive. So, instead of confrontation, he manufactured control. In July of 2003, Jonathan told Michelle he had received a disturbing phone call. According to his version of events, someone had secretly recorded her at a motel, footage of her and Miguel, and was now threatening to release it unless he paid $500,000. It was, he claimed, a blackmail attempt. Panicked and shaken, Michelle admitted the affair. With trembling honesty, she promised it was over, that it had ended, and it would not continue. She swore she would make things right, for the sake of their children, for the sake of everything they had built. Jonathan, seizing the moment, called Miguel directly. His tone was controlled, but firm. He warned Miguel to stay away from Michelle or face the consequences of full exposure, not just to his own family, but publicly. The conversation had its intended effect. Miguel ended the relationship that day. To cement the illusion, Jonathan filed a police report about the supposed blackmail. But law enforcement, trained to spot inconsistencies, quickly noticed problems. There had been no actual ransom drop, no concrete demands, no traceable phone number. The story didn't quite add up. Still, Jonathan maintained the lie. For Michelle, for the authorities, for himself. Privately, he hoped things might return to the way they were, that this storm, too, might pass, that Michelle, having seen the danger and damage the affair could cause, would recommit to their family. But what Jonathan wanted was no longer within reach. For Michelle, something fundamental had shifted. Even after the affair ended, the unhappiness remained. She began quietly telling those closest to her, siblings, cousins, trusted friends, that she was thinking seriously about divorce. The golden cage she had once tolerated now felt suffocating. She no longer saw her future as tied to Jonathan's. Still financially dependent on her husband, Michelle made a move toward autonomy. She took a job as a beauty consultant at a Macy's department store nearby. It wasn't just about money, it was about having something of her own, a life outside the walls of their home, a sense of purpose beyond being a wife and mother. The young woman who had once dreamed of America was now dreaming of freedom. And although she had promised Jonathan that the affair was over, it quietly resumed only weeks later. Michelle began seeing Miguel again, in secret, slipping away for brief meetings. What she didn't know was that Miguel was not entirely the man he appeared to be. Miguel, charming and enigmatic, had a complicated past. Known by multiple aliases, he was wanted in another state for failure to pay child support. His history included more than one chapter he had never shared with Michelle. Eventually, someone tipped off the authorities. Miguel was arrested. And while the charges were administrative, they painted a fuller picture, one that raised questions about his integrity and reliability. When Jonathan learned that Michelle had resumed the affair, even after the blackmail story and her tearful promises, something inside him fractured. He unraveled. His mental state, already unstable, deteriorated rapidly. He began seeing a doctor and was prescribed medication, but instead of stabilizing his mood, the drugs only seemed to cloud his judgment further. His mind raced between obsession and despair, between hope and heartbreak. Jealousy consumed him. He became preoccupied with the idea that Michelle was going to leave him permanently. On some days, he convinced himself she would stay. On others, he couldn't silence the voice whispering that it was already over. The fear was relentless. Then, the weather changed, and with it, the trajectory of their lives. On the evening of January 15th, 2004, a brutal snowstorm swept through Hopewell Township. The roads were slick and visibility low. But Michelle, determined and focused, went to work anyway. She was saving every penny she could. If she was going to file for divorce, she needed financial independence, and she was preparing for it, one shift at a time. She finished work at Macy's around 9:15 p.m., but instead of going home, she drove to meet Miguel. They rendezvoused at a familiar motel, one they had used before. Their time together lasted roughly 2 hours. Around 11 p.m., they said goodbye. Michelle never made it home. In the early hours of January 16th, as snow continued to blanket the roads, a utility worker driving along Jacobs Creek Road spotted something unusual. A silver SUV was parked oddly near an embankment, its engine still running. He pulled over and cautiously approached. There was a woman inside in the driver's seat. Emergency services arrived within minutes. The scene was strange, quiet, cold, unsettling. A single set of footprints led away from the vehicle and disappeared into the woods. There were no tire tracks indicating an accident, no damage to the vehicle, no sign of forced entry. The woman was soon identified as Michelle Nice, a mother of 3, a Macy's consultant, and the wife of a once prominent scientist. Her sudden death was tragic, but what disturbed investigators most was the evidence, or lack thereof. There were no footprints leading toward the vehicle, only away from it. And more alarmingly, the autopsy results told a different story. Michelle had not died in a car crash. Her injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma. The case instantly shifted from tragedy to suspicion. Investigators turned their attention to the three people with the clearest motives: her husband, Jonathan, her lover, Miguel, and Miguel's wife, Patricia. It was a delicate web of relationships, one built on secrets, jealousy, and betrayal. They started with Jonathan. Initially, he presented himself as stunned and devastated. But when detectives asked basic questions, his story began to wobble. He gave conflicting accounts, at first claiming he'd spoken to Michelle that afternoon, then later saying it was in the evening. At one point, he suggested she might have run away, that she had simply decided to leave him and start over. But detectives had already begun connecting the dots. They discovered Jonathan's financial collapse. They uncovered the inconsistencies in his background, including the lie about his age. They learned about the emotional deterioration, the control issues, and most crucially, his awareness of Michelle's ongoing affair. It painted a clear portrait, a man whose life was unraveling, personally, professionally, and emotionally. Eventually, under pressure and mounting evidence, Jonathan confessed. He was arrested and formally charged. The courtroom was quiet as the trial commenced in 2005. The case had captured local headlines and sent waves through the once quiet communities of both Hopewell Township and Collegeville, Pennsylvania. As the trial unfolded, Jonathan changed his story. He no longer portrayed himself as simply confused or distraught. Instead, he offered a new version of events, one that painted him as a man pushed beyond his emotional limits. He claimed that Michelle had attacked him first, suggesting a sudden confrontation that spiraled out of control. According to Jonathan, her alleged aggression provoked a reaction in the heat of the moment, and the situation tragically escalated. This version of events was a drastic departure from earlier statements, but the defense framed it as a case of intense emotional distress. The legal team positioned Jonathan not as a cold-blooded perpetrator, but as a man overwhelmed by heartbreak and desperation. The jury was not unmoved. After lengthy deliberation and under the recommendation of a plea agreement, Jonathan Nice was not convicted of murder, but rather of manslaughter under the influence of extreme emotional disturbance. The decision carried weight. The judge made it unequivocally clear in court that while the act may have been fueled by emotion, it was still a crime, not an accident, and it demanded accountability. Jonathan was sentenced to 8 years in state prison,